to the Mountain and Prairie Podcast. I'm Ed Robertson. My guest today is Bryce Andrews. Bryce is a Montana-based rancher and writer, and he's also the author of the brand new book, Holding Fire, A Reckoning with the American West. Longtime Mountain and Prairie listeners will remember my first conversation with Bryce back in 2019, when we talked about his writing, conservation work, ranching experience, and his first two books. I thoroughly enjoyed that first conversation and was so impressed with Bryce's thoughtfulness, curiosity, and humility. So I was thrilled to have him back on the podcast to discuss Holding Fire. Holding Fire is a thought-provoking memoir that explores Bryce's complicated and evolving relationship with the landscape, culture, and history of the American West. Much of the story focuses on his grandfather's Smith and Wesson revolver, a gun that he inherited and owned for many years while living and working in Montana. But despite being a committed big game hunter and owner of many guns, Bryce's feelings towards that revolver began to change. And as you'll hear him explain, he eventually befriends a master blacksmith, learns to forge steel, and transforms that revolver from a gun into a tool that he now uses to plant trees on his property. I love the book, and it forced me to re-examine some of my baked-in notions about everything from the history of the West to my ideas around hunting for food, mental health, and the culture of the modern-day American West. We talked about why Bryce chose this particular topic for the subject of the book, his long-standing love of hunting, and why he decided to repurpose the revolver into a ranch tool. We discussed what he learned about craftsmanship from the blacksmith, the importance of converting guilt into action, and how fatherhood has changed his approach to life and work. We also talk about this summer's Old Salt Festival in Montana, he and his wife's stewardship of their ranch, and he offers up a lot of excellent book recommendations. And if you want to read and discuss a chapter of Bryce's book for free, then download the new social reading app called Threadable. I've recently partnered with Threadable to highlight and discuss a number of readings about the history of the American West, including chapters from Sarah Dance's Losing Eden and Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz's An Indigenous People's History of the United States. Threadable allows users to read portions of great books, then discuss them in a fun and interactive way. As of this recording, Threadable is only for iOS, but if you want to read a sample of Holding Fire and discuss it with the Mountain and Prairie community, then follow the link in the episode notes to download the app. Big thanks to Bryce for another wonderful conversation, and thank you for listening. Hope you enjoy. Bryce, I'm so glad to reconnect with you. It makes me feel good that maybe I didn't completely screw it up last time we were talking, that you wanted to come back and talk to me again. But I just absolutely loved your new book. Loved it. And as we were saying before we started recording, it helped me work through some of my thoughts about the American West and the complex history of the West. And so, first of all, thank you for writing it. And then second of all, I'd love to know how you decided to write this as a book, or how you decided to tackle it as a book. Because I imagine, in your day-to-day life and everything you're doing and thinking about and reading about, there are a lot of different options of books. And this one seems to me like it was probably a pretty challenging thing to get your head around. So can you talk a little bit about maybe the process of deciding to tackle this subject, very personal subject, as a book?
Sure. And Ed, it's great to be back and wonderful to talk with you again. It's, I really respect what you're doing with the show, and I just think it's excellent work. Yeah. I mean,
thank you.
One of the things that is so strange about, certainly an agricultural life, but I'm guessing any life, is that, you have these sort of day-to-day, tides and currents in your life. You've got a big task on the farm or the ranch and life gets busy for a while, or you've got these sort of swings between life feeling good or not so good. Then you also have these larger kind of through line issues and struggles. And this book is really about that level of stuff, because Holding Fire is sort of the crystallization in my mind of more than a decade spent working as a ranch manager in some of the more wild parts of the Northern Rockies. And, for me, this book really feels like something that I needed to try to say correctly and clearly for a long time before I actually sat down to write it. So, a lot of the story has to do with first embracing and then beginning to struggle with, and then eventually finding myself in opposition to certain parts of the myth of the West and certain things that I believed about the work I did and the place where I was doing it.
Yeah. And I was just so impressed with the way you wove in your family's history going back, generations. But I don't want to like go through every aspect of the book because I really encourage people to read it. I mean, I read it in two sittings. I mean, I cranked through it and I underlined stuff on every page. So I really want people to read the book, but I do want to kind of give people a flavor of it. And so can you just kind of give, in the intro, I will have explained a bit about the plot of the book or the narrative of the book, but just to establish some background, can you talk a bit about your dad's path and how he, his experience when the Vietnam War draft started coming his way and the decisions he made?
Sure. Yeah. And actually, I appreciate you asking about my dad. And one of the interesting things about having written this book is realizing how much my father's story and his decisions and his, strength and dedication to his ideals has informed the arc of my life. I mean, that was something I probably didn't understand when I set out to write this. But, my dad was a senior in college when his draft number came up, and he had a draft number that would have made sure that he was sent to Vietnam. And he chose instead to apply for conscientious objector status, which meant that he was morally opposed to fighting in a war, which is not exactly the same thing as pacifism, but is an important position and a status that was often granted only to people who were members of religious groups and sects that prohibited violence. And my dad wasn't really. This was a conviction that he had arrived at on his own and a belief that he held, and he really fought for it. He, went before the draft board, he was denied, he reapplied, and eventually, based on the strength of his argument and the essays he wrote and the way he answered questions and his sort of inflexible dedication to peace, he was granted that status. So he did alternative service during the war. And that's actually what brought my parents to Seattle, which is where I was born. So yeah, I think one of the things has been really neat about undertaking this project is realizing what an effect and an influence my father's choices and convictions have on my life.
Yeah, and I think it's worth noting that when people read the book, they'll see this. But when you explain it like that it sounds tough. But I feel like the thing that was the really the toughest and hard for me to get my head around, and actually kind of made me squirm when I was reading it, was his family's reaction to him doing that. And it wasn't, if I'm remembering correctly, it wasn't supported. It was kind of a surprise and kind of looked down upon by his family. Is that correct?
Well, I think his family's reaction, it wasn't monolithic. It wasn't all just one thing. Yeah. But certainly he had family members who were deeply critical and didn't respect his choice. But one of the things that I wanted to make really clear is that his father, my grandfather, Robert Andrews, who did serve in World War II, did not agree with my father's decision to be a conscientious objector, but he did respect it in the end, and he wrote a letter of support to the draft board that my dad and I both think carried a lot of water because it came from somebody who had served. And what it said in a nutshell is, I don't agree with my son's position, but I respect it. And I know that he is an honest person and that this is his truth. And so I think, although some people in the family were not supportive, I think, when the chips were down, I think that there was some important support there too. And I think, that's one of the things that this book made me think about is, what are the roots of nonviolence or violence in a life? And, when I trace lines of those two things back through my own family history, it becomes really interesting because you can see, the steps that are taken away from violence and toward peace, running back a couple of generations. And I ended up feeling really proud about that. I think that's one thing that might be at times easy to miss in the book is just how proud I am the depth of some of those roots of making better choices about how you are in terms of violence in the world.
Well, that's one thing that I really loved about the book is there's a part, I think it was about midway through, where you're talking about your mother, who's a photographer, black and white photographer, and how she talks about there's the light and there's the shadow. And so there's always two sides to everything. And I feel like in this book, you really hit on that on so many different levels. And you talk about like the pride that you were just talking about, but also the guilt of just the being of European descent and coming into, being one of these folks that's coming into the West and everything that came. But you're also proud of the history of nonviolence as well. And so I think that's the kind of thing that I just don't think you can get anywhere but a book, is really a nuanced examination of complex things where there is this black and white, yin and yang. And I feel like you examine it on so many levels in a really a masterful way. It's really just awesome. Can you, there's a part where you talk about when you show up in the West and you're working at the Sun Ranch and you're not carrying a pistol at that point. And that was received by some folks as maybe you're not really committed. You're not, like some old lady says, how are you supposed to protect cows if you're not carrying a gun? And so can you talk a bit about how guns entered your life, both as a tool and as a tool for hunting and a tool for ranch work, but then as, as for protection against other humans?
Yeah. I mean, I think there are a couple different ways guns have existed. There are many ways guns exist in the world, but a couple of the important ones for me in the West have been gun as tool versus gun as totemic object. And I think separating the two is becoming increasingly important to me because, when I first came to the Sun Ranch, I actually had some experience with the gun as a tool because as a child I had killed prairie dogs on the ranch where I had stayed and worked with my godparents out by Laurel. So I had experience with them as a tool that was used in the course of the work of ranching. And I guess I had some sort of vague experience with them as a totem in the same way that we all do, being raised on a diet of, like Western film and cowboy culture and all the other things that most of us who are kids here in the West internalize. But I guess I didn't really understand the degree to which having or not having a gun on my person in certain situations either made me part of a group or outside of it. And that was one of the things that I did come to understand at the Sun Ranch, because there were really legitimate uses for those weapons in the course of our work. And yet it was certainly possible to do most aspects of the work without them. And I did. So it was really interesting to encounter a mindset where, if I wasn't carrying a gun, I wasn't doing my job. And, I didn't think about it this way at the time, but now when I think about that, I think, what does that mean my job really was?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, first of all, can you talk about your experience as a hunter? Because I just about this time last year, actually, I shot my first elk, and I was 44 then. So I was kind of a little late to the game, but it was such a life-changing experience for me for a million different reasons. And I actually recorded a whole podcast about it if you want to listen to that. But it was such a powerful experience, and I gained an appreciation for so many different things. And one of them is how little I know about hunting, because I went with a guy who's about as good as you can get. And so can you give your kind of history hunting big game in the West? Because I think that's important for people to really understand.
Well, yeah. And my history with hunting big animals in the West is really weird because the first large animal I ever killed was a wolf. It was in the course of the work I was doing at the Sun Ranch, and that's the subject of my first book, Bad Luck Way. That was my introduction with very little firearm experience to hunting big animals. And that was something that troubled me and took me a long time to unpack, which I did at length in my first book. But hunting large game to eat, for me has always been kind of a different thing, because for as long as I've been doing it, and I've been doing it since I moved to Montana a decade and a half ago, I've always loved hunting, and I've always struggled with killing. And I've always had those two things coexisting in me. But, for me, hunting is this incredibly valuable, powerful, essential aspect of living from and on land. You know, my wife and I, we raise cattle and we grow berries here on our farm near Missoula, but, you know, most of the meat that we eat is wild game. And I wouldn't have it any other way, because, you know, the experience of being out there and being in a largely intact ecosystem with healthy populations of deer and elk, it really feeds something in me that goes beyond the actual eating of meat. A big part of this book has to do with unpacking the different phases of my relationship with hunting, because I loved it when I first started doing it. I became deeply uncomfortable with it at a certain point. And the book really goes through that process of learning and struggling and figuring out, you know, which parts of this are good for me and which parts of this do I need to leave behind. And I've ended up in a place where I feel extremely good about harvesting wild meat and feeding my family with it now, as long as I do it in a way that's respectful, and as long as I'm, you know, doing it in a way where I'm not adversely affecting the ecology of the place where I live.
Sure. Yeah. And you offer some really great examples in there of how that can go sideways, even with the best of intentions, you know, like when one of the places is overhunted and how you notice that the wildlife changes just pretty quickly. I felt like that was a really powerful part for me, but I'm with you on the hunting. I mean, it was a very emotional experience for me, which I kind of expected, but I'll tell you the part that I didn't expect was when I brought the meat home and we served it up. And I think the first thing we did was elk tacos, and my little girls started eating it and they started talking about how great it was. And I literally started tearing up. And so there's just something in our DNA, I think, about going out and gathering the meat and bringing it back to your family. It's really powerful. That's what you need to go deep on next time. Just that whole thing. 'Cause I need you to help me understand that.
Yeah. Certainly somebody needs, I mean, I think there are a lot of people who are thinking about that right now in ways that maybe have been dormant for a while. You know, people used to understand this very well. And that's another theme that I think is important in this story is, you know, how much of understanding how to be at home in this landscape and how to be, you know, how to do things in a proper way here has to do with the simple act of beginning to listen more meaningfully to Native people and indigenous cultures and what they have to say about what it means to be in a reciprocal relationship with a place like the West.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so kind of the side of that coin is the whole tough guy thing that comes with guns in the West. And there's a story in the book where you have to deal with the trespasser. And I used to be in the ranch brokerage business, and I had a few run-ins with what I thought were crazy people with guns. Like, they never pointed them at me, but they had them at their side and were kind of threatening, you know, not straight up saying I'm going to shoot you, but I was scared. And so it may be the story that you recounted in the book, but what's the scariest interaction you've ever had with a gun and a person where you thought, all right, this is going to be, this could be bad? I mean, you recount several pretty scary things in the book, but is there one that sticks out in your mind?
Well, honestly, I mean, the first thing that comes into my mind is Jesus said, I'm so tired of tough guys with guns.
I'm so sick of it.
I've just had enough of it because it's such a limited way of being in the world. And frankly, it's just not helping anything anymore. Who knows if it ever was. You know, the time that you're referencing there, that probably was one of the 2 or 3 scariest gun encounters I've had. And it was with a trespasser at night on a ranch who went zooming by my bunkhouse, and I chased him down in a truck. And, you know, I remember, you know, leaving the house. My dad was actually visiting me for a couple nights, and I was going to grab the ranch rifle, you know, this gun that the ranch kept around mostly because I didn't have one. And Dad said, you should leave that behind. But I took it because it made me feel more comfortable to have a weapon, because I knew that the trespasser probably would. But when I got up there and left the car beside the road, or the truck beside the road, and walked up to his window. I didn't take the gun with me. And I'm really lucky I didn't take it. When I was going out the door, I remember my dad saying, if you take that gun, if you have that gun with you, there's a chance you'll use it. And he said, if you don't, you won't. And in some ways, it's as simple as that. You know, when I went up the road to meet this guy who was in fact armed and was very threatening, although he didn't ever stick a barrel in my face, you know, I wasn't armed. I only had, you know, the resources that I carried within me, which were, you know, a certain resolve and whatever authority I could muster. And in fact, that was enough in the end. You know, I just kept telling him respectfully but firmly that he had to leave. And he shouted at me, and I just kept telling him that. And in the end, it worked out okay. He went back down the road. But I really felt the presence of that violence. And one of the crazy things about thinking about this story and writing it is if you become sensitized to the presence of that violence, you will start to notice it almost everywhere in the West. And that is one of the things that we fundamentally need to work on in the decades and centuries to come. You know, I think what I said at the time in the book, I said that the night was gravid with violence. And yeah, once you're sensitized to that feeling, you start to notice it other places, and it makes you really uncomfortable.
It does. And the tough guy thing, I get real fed up with that. And I've been fortunate enough on this podcast to get to talk to legit tough people. And I've had a lot of Navy SEALs on here. I mean, I had a guy who's 30-year career in the Navy SEALs, Master Chief, the whole deal. And every one of those Navy SEALs I've had on here, not a single one of them acts like a tough guy. And they are the definition of tough guys, but they don't have that kind of in your face, you know, I'm barking from the treetops that they're so tough. They just are. And I don't know, there's something about that kind of bully mentality that comes with some of these types, like the types that came after me that time with the gun, that it burns me up. I don't know why, because they're not tough.
Well, and I mean, it burns you up, and it's also really sad because, yes, you know, that form of bullying is an expression of desperation. It's an expression of fear. And that's something I get into in this book is, you know, in some ways, this almost religious obsessive fixation with arming ourselves in America has to do with this fear that I think is really connected to the violence that's woven into the history of the last several hundred years here with the European conquest of the Americas. You know, I think you can draw a through line between how angry and afraid so many people are and this sort of, I guess, low level, almost subconscious knowledge that the past is violent and that sometimes, you know, bills for the violence of the past come due.
Mm-hmm. There was a quote I have in my notes here and there was, you mentioned desperation and loneliness as two of the kind of underlying factors in the West. And I think you could really expand it throughout the whole United States at this point. I don't know, man. This book, like, it helped me figure stuff out, and it also, like any great book, it helped me figure some stuff out, but then it opened up a lot of new questions that I need to think about. So again, not trying to go overboard with the praise, but I really loved it. Kind of last thing about maybe not last thing, but can you talk about that winter that you had that was pretty rough, where your thoughts about specifically your grandfather's .357 Magnum, how that winter and kind of what happened and how your mind started changing about these issues, or how you started realizing that there's a lot more there that needs to be examined?
Sure. I mean, I had a pretty dark winter on a ranch that I was managing, and, you know, some of it had to do with external circumstances. You know, I had a horse that I was really attached to that I had to put down. You know, I had a really bad epidemic of disease in the calves. There was a lot of death around me in many ways, and looking back on it now, I can say, like, yeah, I was depressed and I was having self-destructive thoughts. But a lot of those came to rest on my grandfather's .357, which is the inherited weapon that's at the center of this story. You know, the story on a practical level is about getting this gun and using it and trying to figure out, you know, once it becomes burdensome or a potential, you know, potential agent of self-harm, what do you do with it? And I mean, that winter, it's interesting because, I don't remember that winter as being just a sheer misery all the time. It's that there was so much death around me and I was wrestling with so many weighty things that I wasn't as insulated from despair as I might otherwise have been. And
sure,
having a gun when you're in a situation like that is profoundly dangerous. It's even dangerous for somebody like me. And I'm somebody who, it may not always come out in an interview like this about an important and difficult subject like the ones we've been talking about, but I'm a very, very hopeful person. I believe that things should get better as time goes along. I believe there's precedent for it, even that that we are capable of ending up in a better situation than we're in. But I'll tell you, to be on a dark night in a in a little house you built on a ranch by yourself, surrounded by death, and to have a gun with you and have dark thoughts, it really was a sobering thing and a turning point for me. Because when I think about it, I remember this thing that a rancher friend once said to me. He said, a guy buys a backhoe and everything starts looking like it needs to be a hole,
Yeah, I remember that. Yep.
And there's something about the ubiquity of firearms, the amount of them we keep around in the West and elsewhere, that I think is just deeply unhealthy, because tools exert a pull on us. Tools want to be used insofar as that's possible for inanimate objects. Or maybe a better way of saying it is we want to use the tools we surround ourselves with. And if you surround yourself with weapons that are actually, like in the case of the 357, explicitly designed for killing people, I think that exerts a pressure on people. And that can be a pressure to be destructive in the world or to be destructive to yourself. And that's the form it took for me. So, I had some very dark moments that year and around that time. But when I think about them now, I actually think about those moments with a sense of gratitude, because for me, that marked the turning point in my relationship with that weapon. And also it marked a moment at which I truly understood something about the life I was living, the history that I was functioning in, and the effect that I wanted to have on it. It made me very consciously aware that I wanted to, in some meaningful way, break with aspects of the past.
Yeah, I really appreciated that part of the book. You talk a lot about some of the guilt that you feel. And it's funny because just last week I interviewed the chief scientist for the Nature Conservancy, a woman named Catherine Hayhoe, and that episode won't come out till the end of February. But she's talking about, she's a climate scientist and talking about climate change. And there's a point in her book, it's called Saving Us, a really good book, where she interviews a lot of different psychiatrists, psychologists, and talks about the role that guilt can play. And it's kind of this knife edge where on one side, guilt can leave you frozen and feeling despair and hopeless and like you're not going to do anything. But on the other side, guilt can spur you to action, and guilt can be a very important tool. And I that's what I really liked about this book is that, you hear a lot these days of people, particularly people that have the same skin color I do, of just this endless guilt. But without any action, it's just kind of beating the hell out of themselves without taking action. And what I loved about your book is you did take action. You use that guilt as fuel to try to make things better in your corner of the world. And so I don't want to, go through every aspect of the book, but you decide to turn that gun into a tool that you can use on your ranch. And can you talk about when you visited with the Native American women and talked to them about the idea? Because I really thought particularly their ideas about fire and what fire means in their culture versus our culture. Can you talk about that aspect of the story?
Sure. Yeah. There are a lot of really great things wrapped up in your question there. For one, I want to just start by saying that one of the main things that I've come to believe from writing this book is that if you live in a state of guilt and inaction, it's unhealthy and unhelpful and kind of disingenuous, because you actually can't maintain an honest feeling of guilt without trying to remedy it, really.
That's a great point.
And guilt and action feel so different. That's the thing, is that one of them's heavy and the other one's light. That's one way to look at it. But you asked me about when I talked with Jermaine and Ruth. And Jermaine White is a good friend of mine who I knew in a professional capacity for a long time and has just become a wonderful person in my life. But I went up, and Jermaine's a member of the Confederated Salish and Kootenai Tribes, and in fact used to be their director of education and outreach, which meant that she was in the position of speaking publicly for the tribes for, I think, a couple decades maybe. I'm not sure how long. When she listens to this, she'll probably correct me. But I went up to talk to Jermaine about the gun because I had decided that I wanted to turn my grandfather's revolver into something that had more generative, creative, and less destructive affinities and potential. And so I went and talked to her. And one thing that I remember her saying is that, because I had these really difficult feelings about destroying a gift that came from my grandfather. That was a tough thing for me. I knew I wanted this gun out of my life. I didn't want it to be something that was capable of killing anymore. But I also wanted to honor my family. And one of the things that Jermaine said to me that has always resonated is that it's only in the European cosmology that fire is looked at as destructive or associated with hell. She said native people have used fire to regenerate and as an agent of rebirth on this landscape for millennia. And they've done that very practically. Like they burned forests to make them healthier. And so that was just such a wonderful thing for me to kind of sit with and think, okay, just because I'm going to change this with fire doesn't mean I'm destroying it. It can be remaking rather than unmaking. And that felt very important to me. Another thing that Jermaine said, and something that I intend to tell anybody who will listen, is I remember doing a lot of hand-wringing about, like, I have these good intentions as a son of colonialists, a son of settlers. And like my family goes all the way back to the Plymouth colony. So some of my ancestors have been around and been party to this for a long time. I had these good intentions, wanting to do something different. And it all felt so complicated. Like, you have these big picture intentions, and what do you do with your time? What do you do with all that time between breakfast and dinner? And I remember Jermaine just saying once, like, in a pretty straightforward way, she's like, the last 200 years were bad. Like, they were bad for native peoples. They were bad ecologically. It's up to us to just make sure that the next 200 years are better. And in some ways, just having that clear and concise of a formulation of something that I thought a lot about has been really, really helpful. But you have to pair it with a good understanding of what better actually means. And better to me means more ecologically whole and more just in terms of the way people deal with each other and the land.
Yeah, I actually have that quote in my notes as word for word, because I thought that was such a good way a productive way of thinking about things. Because I'm with you, I can get just overwhelmed, especially when you're focusing on just endless negativity, and there's always negativity. I mean, I think in a lot of ways humans are can be a kind of a despicable animal in a lot of ways. But if you're just endlessly focusing on that, you can't even think about going forward. And just this idea of like, yeah, all right, it was bad, but let's do better. Let's do better. And I think, and I feel like that's, what you're doing on your property is just a perfect example of that. You're working extremely hard to make your corner of the world better. And I was wondering if you could just talk a bit about some of the things you've done. This is kind of outside the scope of the book. I mean, you talk about planting trees and that kind of thing, but I'd love to hear more about what you've done on your property since you purchased it, because I know like you've changed some stuff with the grazing, but can you just talk a bit about how you've approached making your property more sustainable, more regenerative, more in line with the way you want it to be?
Yeah, and I'm going to use the word we when I talk about this, because it's my wife Jillian as much as it is me working on this stuff. But since we've been here, we've basically we changed the entire way that livestock graze on this place. So we have implemented a rotational grazing system where we're trying to manage for carbon sequestration by developing, stronger stands of grasses and roots, and trying to improve our species diversity and the health of the grassland by timing our grazing well and, limiting impacts at a certain point. The most interesting thing to me that we're doing right now is we have these two areas that are fenced out in different ways on our place. We've got a you-pick raspberry patch, which has a big tall fence around it, which keeps deer and bears out, so that we can grow that crop and provide berries to people in our community and have people coming here and picking them and enjoying this place and this ecosystem. And then we also just, a couple hundred yards away, we have an area that I fence the cattle out of, and where I've been working to, and I will say I here because I've done most of this, been planting hundreds of native trees and shrubs. So we're trying to restore a chunk of complex, intact forest to a part of the farm that used to be forested. And it's really, really fun to walk between those two places because it's a physical manifestation of the kind of balance that I think we need to aim for more intentionally in this part of the world, because we have an area where we're practicing this like very concentrated, very intensive form of agriculture, and we have to keep some wildlife out. And then we have an area that's actually of equivalent size that we're restoring, so it's of greater use to native species. And then we have a much larger area on the farm, the whole farm, that's shared space, and that's how we look at it. So we've made some big changes, and we want to keep doing that. We want to keep working on our restoration projects. We want to keep developing a local market for beef. So we have some cool stuff going on. We raise grass-finished beef, and sell it locally. But we also have a beef donation program. So when people purchase from us, we'll give them a discount if they'll donate a percentage of it to a food bank or a food distribution effort in our area. And that's really important because we live in a part of the state. We actually live on the Flathead reservation where people are food insecure. And so for them to be able to get local food and for other beef customers to be able to help with it is really important. So we've made some changes. There's a lot still to do. I mean, I would never say that what we're doing here is sufficient. I feel like there's a lot more to be done still.
So that, no question, could be like 10 full-time jobs doing all that. And so how does writing fit in when you've got all this other great stuff going on? I mean, like when you were writing this book, what's your process of tackling a project like this when you've got so much? Because I just kept thinking, man, I bet he is so tired. And now you got a little kid in the mix too, which adds to that. But how do you balance all this important work with the land with your writing work?
I mean, I think you're right. I am tired a lot of the time.
Good. I'm glad I'm not the only one. I'm not doing anything.
No, like you're making shows on a terrifyingly regular basis. You're getting a lot of things out in the world, and that's a huge thing. But the thing is, the two forms of work feed each other, right? I mean, to me, I wouldn't be a writer. I wouldn't be a writer if I hadn't gone to work on a ranch. And I don't think that I would be able to make my living in agriculture because of the economics of it if I didn't continue to work as a writer. So in some ways, having those two poles in a life, that works really well for me. And I think it works for, I have friends who do similar things. Nathaniel Ian Miller is an amazing writer, fiction writer, whose book everybody should read. It's The Memoirs of Stockholm Sven, not about the West, but a really cool book. And he's a rancher and a writer. And we talk about this a lot, the ways in which, one can kind of be an antidote to the other until the day they both pile up on you and then they just squash you flat. So it's a balance, but what life isn't, I guess.
Yeah, definitely. it definitely in your world, they definitely seem to feed each other. And so if you're not working on a book, or maybe you always are working on a book, but how do you keep your writing craft sharp? Because when I read your work, like I'm actually trying to work on a writing project, and then when I read your work, I'm like, there is a 0% chance that I could ever write this well. And I do the same thing with like Kristen Browski, all the real writers I have on this podcast. I'm like, I could work for my entire life. I could never be this good of a writer. So it's not like discouraging to me, because I'm like, I just need to do my own style and not try to be like awesome like these folks. but how do you keep it sharp? I mean, do you write essays? Do you have a journal? Are you always working on a book? What's your process for keeping the craft honed in?
Well, first of all, I want to push back and say a little bit that the more time I spend writing, the more I realize that what's interesting about really good writing is that there's truth in it, and the person's voice is their own actual voice, that they're speaking their honest truth. And I think most people can do that. You just have to, it's just not that many people are obsessive enough about it to sit there for the amount of hours you have to do to get it to a state that feels right. I think you're kind of asking about my writing practice. That's sort of like what writers talk about sometimes. For me, journaling is really important because I have a terrible memory. And so if I don't make notes on or about the time that something happens, I won't have enough of a record of it to be able to tell it faithfully. And so if I'm almost always working on a book in some capacity, I'm already thinking forward beyond this project. Although I'm not writing every day, drafting every day, I journal all the time. I refer to those journals when I sit down to actually draft something that's part of a larger project. And also, I just really like stories. I think about them all the time. I like words and stories, and they're always in my mind. And I think that's part of what's important if you want to do writing. If you want to write and have it be your life and your living, you really have to like it, because you're going to spend a lot of time with it.
Do you like it? I mean, is it extremely challenging for you? Is it like you like it like I like going on a 30-mile run? Like, I like that. I love it. It's one of the best things I can do. But in the moment, it whips my ass. Is that, or do you just enjoy the process? Because I've had writers of, both. So I've had some writers on here who it's just like pulling teeth, and then some who it's a joyful experience 99% of the time. Where are you on that spectrum?
Well, actually, so I'm a runner too. And I would say writing is
I remember that.
Yeah, and writing is like running. That's that for me anyway. It's like running, but I'm also somebody who actually enjoys running. Or maybe I've just convinced myself I enjoy both these things. I'm not really sure about that. I guess, I've always kind of chafed a little bit when people say like, oh man, I get in that chair and I hate it. It's like, wringing blood from the stone. It's like, well, then why do you do it? Because it can be hard and meaningful, but at no point in the process do I despise it. And I think if I did, I'd stop doing it. It's satisfying to work at something that you can do well when you're at your best. And it's also rewarding to know that you've said one or two things the best way you could possibly figure out to say them. Because that's something that just doesn't happen to me when I'm speaking, And so I think it's that stuff, like on balance, I enjoy the time that I spend writing. And if that balance ever shifts, I would think seriously about doing something else.
That seems very reasonable to me. I'm with you. I mean, I guess everybody's different, but if it was just like the worst thing in the world all day long, I think I read somewhere that John Krakauer, it's just awful for him. And I heard an interview with him recently where he said he's done. He's not writing anymore because it's just so awful for him. So I don't know. Everybody's different, I guess. All right. Here's the big question for you, which I'm very interested in. You've got an 11-month-old daughter, which is such a big deal. And I've got 2 daughters. I'm ahead of you. I got a 7-year-old and a 4-year-old. But having those girls, it was just such a huge, huge change. And I know people who are listening to this who don't have kids, they're like, these guys are going to be talking in cliches the whole time. But they're cliches for the reason, because they're all true. So talk to me about how this sweet little girl has changed if at all, changed your thoughts on any of this work you're doing, storytelling, the work you're doing with the land. I mean, how have you changed as a person in the past 11 months?
Well, this book ends with planting trees, basically rewilding a portion of this farm. And one of the things about having a kid is that you can look farther into the future all of a sudden. Anybody can look into the future, but to actually and practically and in your heart feel it, for me, it took having a daughter. And so like when I look out, in some ways life is just the same, only, we only socialize between the hours of 10 a.m. and 4 p.m., like my wife and I.
Yeah.
But in other ways, the way I see the world has completely changed, because when I look out at that planting, I know that my daughter will probably see those trees, if she's lucky, she'll see those trees as mature trees. She'll be able to sit under them in the shade of them. And right now they're, about as thick around as a pencil or a broomstick, depending on, what kind of tree they are. The other thing too is that so much of this book for me was about looking back and examining the past and trying to figure out, how do you keep what's good in the past and break with what's damaging? But having our daughter here, I just find myself naturally thinking forward. And one of the things, we were talking about the difference between guilt and action. And if you're thinking about the future, you incline toward action. So for me, in some ways, like the way that this book ends, which is on a note, I think, of hope and action to some extent, that's all down to her, really, because I drafted it for the first time while Jillian was pregnant with our daughter. But by the time I was finishing the edits and getting it all settled, she was in the world. And it made me feel and think and write very differently about what's possible here and what our responsibilities are to the future. And that's the way, I think, one of the ways in which it's changed. Also, babies are extremely funny. Nobody really impressed that on me enough, but like I've laughed more in the last 11 months than probably in the preceding 10 years. I mean, our daughter is just a riot and a lot of fun.
Is she moving or is she walking at this point? I can't remember.
For the non-initiated out there, there's like this stage they talk about that's called surfing, where they pull themselves up on low things and look like little surfers trying to keep their balance. That's right where she is. And she can say the word banana. That's
nice.
Yeah. Yeah. It's pretty cool.
It is cool, man. It's so cool. And it just gets better and better. And it's just amazing how they turn into their own little people. And I remember when I was, before I had kids, or even when I was a single guy and I'd hear people talking about kids, I'm like, it's the most boring thing in the world. Now I could talk about it all day. It's just, I love it. Another thing you and I have coming up that I'm excited about is the Old Salt Festival in near Missoula this summer. And I know you've been involved in some of that with some of the planning. How'd you get involved in that? And talk about what you're excited about that festival, because I'm super excited for it.
Oh, yeah, for sure. So I got involved because my friend Cole Mannix from the Mannix Ranch and the Old Salt Co-op got in touch with me about the prospect of helping to organize some readers and speakers at this festival that he was putting on, which would celebrate land stewardship, locally produced food, particularly meat, and music and writing up in the Blackfoot on their family ranch. And the Mannix Ranch is this like gorgeous spread in a lovely part of the Blackfoot. And they were going to have this 2-day festival up there in Helmville. And Cole asked me if I would help and organize some writers and speakers to come in and bring some more context to this celebration of music and food. So it's going to be like, open fire, whole animal cookery, and interesting chefs and people talking about making their living from the land and, engaging with that place. And there's going to be tons of bands, but there's also going to be this literary component. And that's what I was working on. So I actually got David James Duncan agreed to come and be a headliner for us. And Deborah Magpie Erling is going to be telling ghost stories. And for people who aren't familiar with her work. She's written this amazing book called Perma Red. And then David, of course, is a very famous author who has his probably masterwork. This book called Sun House is coming out this summer. He's been working on it for 16 years, and he'll be reading from that up there. And then Chris Dombrowski is also going to be there. And so Chris and I are going to be there reading as well. So we have this awesome kind of slate of people coming together to be part of this festival and just celebrate land stewardship and have a good time up in the Blackfoot.
I can't wait. I think it's going to be, and so if things go as I have them planned, I did an interview with Cole Mannix that will be coming out the week before I release this. So if people can go back and listen to that to really hear the history of the Mannix family and what they've been doing up there and kind of the idea behind the Old Salt Co-op and the Old Salt Festival. I'm just pumped I get to be there and hang out, and it'll be fun to finally meet you in person after all these years.
Oh yeah, it'll be a blast up there.
It's gonna be great. One more question that I meant to ask a minute ago, but I skipped over it. In the book, you connect with a bunch of different craftsmen who help you with this process of transforming the gun into a tool that you can use. But you end up with one of what people say is the best metalsmith in blacksmith in Montana, a guy named Jeffrey Funk. And I was wondering, I mean, you obviously learned how to work with metal with this guy, but I was wondering if you learned any other lessons just about craftsmanship, creativity, because you're a craftsman with words. And I was wondering what lessons you may have taken from that guy, because he just seemed like a pretty special dude.
Right. Yeah. And so now if Jeffrey heard your intro there, he would say he doesn't like superlatives, like, best blacksmith but the truth is he's an extremely, extremely great craftsman and can do things with metal that most people could hardly dream up. And so I learned a lot, practically speaking, from Jeffrey. He and his wife Betsy, made me feel totally at home at their place. He taught me a lot at the New Agrarian School, which is where he teaches blacksmithing. It's an amazing place, and if anybody ever wants to check it out and take a class there, they absolutely should do that. It'd change your life. But the thing that struck me about Jeffrey over and above the level of his craft, which is extremely great, is the fact that he's someone who seems at peace with his work in a way that most people in my experience aren't. He loves making beautiful things, and he makes them all the time. And that has an incredible effect on a person, I think, in my experience. He is a really exacting craftsman, so I don't think he's always happy while he's working. I think sometimes he's probably frustrated. But he knows how to build things from the ground up, and he knows the value of that. And he can also locate that within a philosophy. So, the New Agrarian School, this place where Jeffrey teaches, it's really cool. He offers these classes. Like one of them is called Wild Iron, and he takes students and they mine their own ore in eastern Montana. They bring it back. They smelt and process the ore in a furnace that they build, a clay furnace, and that they fire with charcoal that they make, and then they work with the resulting iron. So they teach people how to do things, crafts that are essential to the modern world, but that have been mostly forgotten or mechanized to such an extent that we simply couldn't do them because we lack the expertise anymore. So, I think Jeffrey's philosophy is that exposing people to that work and showing them from the ground up how you do something like that makes them feel profoundly empowered and motivates them to act in a way that's responsible in the world. And I think he's right to think that that's true.
I loved reading about him, and I loved it in the book, but I love in this conversation the focus on action, because the older I get and the more I learn how my crazy mind works, the more I realize that action is there's a quote I have, action is the antidote to despair, and I completely agree with that. And I feel like of the many lessons from this book, that's one that got hammered home a little bit. It's just, if you're feeling bad about stuff, or if you're uncertain, or if you're uneasy, whatever, action is generally a good way to go. Do you agree with that? Am I off?
No, you're not wrong. Action, as long as you take the time to really know as well as you can what the effect of your action is going to be before you start acting, I think that's the way to go. I mean, I know that when I was out there working with the tool that I made out of my grandfather's gun and planting these little native trees and shrubs out in a pasture that's been, cleared for livestock for 100 years, I felt really good. I felt like, I didn't feel like I was solving all the world's problems, and I'm explicit about that in the book. I don't think that it's enough to do what I did out there. But while I was doing it, I felt like I was pointed in the right direction. I think that's probably the best way to say it. I felt like I was pointed in the right direction and that I was doing something that in some small way helped. And that was a profoundly good feeling to have. And that comes from action.
I love it. 2 final questions. I'm always looking for book recommendations. You've already given a few. Any good books that you've recently read? I feel like last time we talked, you gave me a bunch of recommendations, and I had not read a single one of them, and I love that. So, do you have what? Give me some good ones.
Oh gosh, and I'm sure I said this last time, but I always struggle with that. I think I told you about Nathaniel's book, the Memoirs of Stockholm Sven. That's historical fiction, but also really grapples with some of these questions about despair and how people process it in a way that's interesting and constructive and leads them somewhere. So I'd say, that's a good one. I'm way down this rabbit hole of reading stuff about the Northwest coast, the sort of Salish Sea region. There's a book called A Story as Sharp as a Knife, which is about the myth and story in the Haida culture. It's by Robert Bringhurst. I really enjoyed that. And then I just finished Chris Dombrowski's book a little while ago, and I really liked that. And I've recently read David James Duncan's book, Sun House. And although that's not out yet, I would highly encourage reading that once it hits the world. And he'd be a great person to talk to on the podcast as well, once that's out.
Yeah, I definitely want to make that happen. And he's just, he's obviously a master of his craft, but everybody just talks about what a good guy he is on top of it all. And that's been one of the coolest things about this podcast for me. People, you hear that saying, don't meet your heroes. Well, I've gotten to meet a lot of my heroes through this podcast, and they're all the nicest people that you could ever meet. And they're so cool. And that extends to you. Getting to hang out with these people, they're so good at what they do, so passionate about what they do. And they're nice and generous and cool people. It's made my whole world so much better and made me a much more optimistic person. So thank you, Mr. Andrews, for helping me keep my brain straight and make me be optimistic. So I appreciate it.
Well, it's a pleasure to talk with you, and thank you for having me on. I look forward to seeing you in the summer.
Yeah, man, it'll be fun. Keep up the great work. I will see you in June. Hey, it's Ed again. Thanks so much for listening to the podcast. I know your time is valuable, so it means the world that you spend it listening. If you want to support the podcast and help it to continue to spread and grow, there are a few ways you can help. Number 1, pass it along to a friend or share it on social media. Word of mouth recommendations are the most powerful way for ideas to spread, so I'd love it if you could share the podcast with a few pals who might enjoy it. Number 2, you can go to Apple Podcasts and give it a 5-star review. Good reviews encourage the Apple overlords to suggest the podcast to others. So there's a link in the notes if you'd be so kind as to give it 5 stars. Number 3, you can support the podcast financially via Patreon, and there are exclusive benefits for those who do, including a monthly behind-the-scenes newsletter, Mountain and Prairie stickers, live and recorded video chats with podcast guests, and much more. Number 4, I've also got 2 emails that I send out. The first is my weekly email called Good News from the American West, which I send out every Wednesday. It's only positive news, something we can all use a little more of these days. And my other email is my bi-monthly book recommendations email. 1 email every other month with 5, 6, 7, or 8 books that I've recently read and highly recommend. The thousands of people on both of these lists will vouch for me. No spam or other funny business. And number 5, finally, check out my online store for Mountain and Prairie stickers, shirts, and coffee mugs. I've got some really cool designs from Western artists with more on the way. So head to mountainandprairie.com/shop to check it all out. I'd love to connect with you. I'm on Instagram and LinkedIn, so look me up on either of those platforms by my name or through the links on my website. All right, that's it. Thanks so much for your support.